I love the way that this looks, but I'm gonna take it off because it is a sensory issue like no other. Don't like it. It's probably giving me some sort of rash. Oh no, can I take it off with these press-ons on? That is the question. It's not that type of video. Get your head out of the gutter. Did not like that at all. Whew, that's gonna be a TikTok only prop. Sup nerds, welcome back to my channel. My name is Maddie if you're new here. I hope your day is going well. And today we're gonna talk about vampires. Now, everyone probably is aware of the phenomena that is Twilight. Twilight took over the entire YA section. They may have created it. This story about this 200-year-old vampire falling in love with a pretty average human girl became a cultural reset, if you will, and it truly changed lives. But was it really the blueprint for the vampire craze of the early 2000s? Or did it just steal the spotlight from things that were already growing in the shadows? Today we will be diving into those shadows and exploring the paranormal vampire romance craze of the early 2000s. So in today's video, we will be discussing 5 different series, all of which I read the first book in the series. And we will be basically comparing the tropes and tribulations that I went through rereading these series that I read when I was a wee bean, and I will be basically kind of comparing and contrasting their world building and kind of the lore that all of these series follow. And all of these specifically deal with vampires and have pretty wide renowned fame, but they may have just been locked inside your brain for the last decade or so. Come with me. I won't bite. Hard. Let's start with probably the most painful one. Let me be very clear. This is marked by Kristen and PC and Kristen Cass. It's a mother-daughter duo, and it hit shelves just about 2 years after Twilight did. This book is about Zoe Redbird, who's a semi-popular 16-year-old living in Oklahoma. And in this world, vampires are known about, and there is a very interesting transition period when becoming a vampire in this world. A person will be marked, usually a young person in their teenage years. Crescent moon will show up on their forehead, and they will have to be taken to the House of Night, which is a school for vampires in transition. Because when you get marked in this world, you do not become a full vampire until you basically age out of your puberty status. Zoe, as probably you've guessed if you haven't read this book series, gets marked. So in the middle of the school day, a dude shows up, points at her or something, and she ends up with a crescent tattoo. And as you can probably imagine, her family, a very religious people, do not love this situation whatsoever. Her stepdad almost threatens her life, and they try and get the church together, try and resolve the fact that she has been marked as a vampire, even though in this world there is no changing that. If you are marked, you are going to become a vampire. The one thing about Zoe though is that even though she seems like a normal girl, things don't go normally for her, as her stepfather tries to infringe on what she's supposed to do now that she's been marked. She ends up running away from her home and trying to get to her grandmother's house. And in that kind of time, she ends up in a car accident and she has a vision of this woman. And in the vampire world in this book series, the vampires are a matriarchal society and they worship the goddess of the night. And in this strange vision Zoe has, she's told that she has been selected as one of this woman's chosen, so to speak. It's not really hard to figure out who the person in the dream is because Zoe's got, chosen one written all over her. So once Zoe does get to her grandmother, we end up having kind of my most uncomfortable part about reading this book. A lot of the lore and the backstory of the way that the vampires are talked about in this book series is from the lens of Cherokee people. And according to this story, Zoe is at least a quarter or so Cherokee, And the lore is also blended with a lot of like Greek, like House of Nyx, things like that, elements. So I don't honestly feel like I can speak too much on the representation of the indigenous people referenced in this book series, but when I read it this time, I didn't feel super great about how it was used. Now, if there are people that can let me know about Indigenous or Cherokee specifically, people, reviewers that have read this and reviewed this book, I would love it. I tried to do some research. I couldn't find all that much about the representation, but what I could find didn't seem like it was great representation, but it is heavily influenced on the whole book. So after Zoe wakes up from this dream, she has a completely filled in crescent mark on her forehead. As I said, fledglings only have an outline. She has a full-fledged mark. So once she finally gets to the House of Night, the school where you learn to be a vampire, everyone is like, oh my God, you have a full colored in mark on your forehead. This is apparently big news. Zoe is introduced to her mentor at the school, Nefertiri, and she's like the priestess or whatever of the school. The school seems to be very strangely religious, but like also not religious. It's a little strange. And Zoe then wanders off away from her mentor when she's being introduced to the school and happens upon a couple and a compromising situation, because this is an early 2000s book and we got to get the plot rolling really quickly. So she sees this couple engaged in what she probably thinks is a blowjob. Not quite sure at first, but then she sees the girl scratch the guy's leg, and it's just a lot in the very first like 100 pages of the book series. And as we find out, the guy is very attractive, and the girl is a huge bitch. And not only that, Zoe happens to be dorm mates with this mean girl who is trying to get back together with the guy that she was with in the hallway, who, of course, Zoe walked up on and was like, ooh, awkward turtle, gotta get the fuck out of here at this exact moment. Zoe ends up meeting a bunch of people at the school. There was one character that I really liked called Stevie, I think. It's been a minute since I read this book, so I apologize. And the interactions with pretty much all of the characters were like borderline offensive on a lot of counts. This particular installment seems to have aged the fucking worst, because the entire Scooby gang that Zoe's around, she treats abysmally. She's an awful friend, and she spends a lot of time just judging everyone around her, and then every other person in her little friend group has some sort of like diversity points, but none of them are good representation. At some point, the gay character tells the Black friend character that she's an African queen, and it was just ooh, not great. So I'm gonna be just telling you guys my thoughts and feelings, a little bit of the plot line. The one thing I can say about this particular installment of this particular series is I know that things get wild, and this particular first book did a decent job of establishing the lore and the background, but I can definitely tell you I did not like the characters, didn't really enjoy the fact that the representation was pretty much seemingly stolen from an indigenous people. Respect was not paid where it should have been, but I am potentially interested in reading on, because I know for a fact that this book series has some of the wildest takes on romantic relationships. But speaking of that, let's move on. This follows Skylar, who is from a pretty rich family and goes to a New York elite preparatory school. Think Gossip Girl, but with vampires. This is also one of the only book series that has multiple POVs, and as I was reading it, I found that I really appreciated that. Even though this book came out before Marked, it just felt like it understood the people it was writing for so much more. The one thing I can say about the main character, Skylar, is that she gives me really big Clary from the Shadowhunters vibes. She's like goth artsy chick, but she's fortunately not the only person you have to follow the entire time. And dear God, that was so relieving. The origin of the vampires in this series is actually one of the far more inventive ones, if I may add. This follows a bunch of families in the New York elite that have their ancestry reach back hundreds and hundreds of years. And long story short, they're actually reincarnated angel souls, but that's a lot more complex than I have time to really get into. But what I find interesting about the book series is that it references specifically the Mayflower. And the reason why I find this fascinating is because I had ancestors on the Mayflower. I am not, as you can probably tell, a New York elite family member. Like, I didn't go to a prep school, but there is a reference to a Billington, and that is the people that my grandmother is like, we are directly related to this family that came over on the Mayflower. And this book series actually referenced people on the Mayflower. Some of this history is actual history, which I found very intriguing. And as I was reading this book, I kind of worried that maybe I was just racist against Oklahomans because I really fucking hated Marked. And this book series, first book in this series, it felt so good to read a book written by someone who seemed to actually give a shit about what they were writing about. But I digress. So our cast of characters, as I was saying, includes Oliver, Skylar's best friend, who happens to have major Simon energy, as I was saying, regarding the Shadowhunters. And then we've got Bliss, who is a new debutante from Texas. She's fantastic as well. She's got this big fiery red hair. I love her character. Mimi and Jack are the resident power twins. They've also got a lot of Cersei and Jaime Lannister energy, if you know what I'm saying. And then there's also a bad boy, whose name I don't remember anymore, but he doesn't seem very important because he's kind of off screen a lot, but he's hanging out with Bliss a lot, so that's kind of the vibe you're going for there. What I found particularly interesting about this book is that Mimi, the mean girl, has a POV, and she is probably the only character in all of the books that I read where she is very specifically an antagonist, but she's given a backstory that makes sense. A lot of her decisions and actions have a lot of reasoning behind them, and I found that very, very interesting. So the way that this kind of unfolds is all of the young people in these families don't know what's happening to them, but they have these urges to like eat people. And then there's also potentially murders happening. And it's pretty interesting. I would once again consider reading on in this series. For a book series where the angel soul reincarnation happens, it didn't actually give me a lot to rant about, so I'm gonna just move on. So I would like to pause everything and just say, Morganville has a TV series? I don't remember this happening. This is the Morganville series, starts with glass houses. I was head over heels in love with this series. I remember very much liking this series as I was growing up for reasons that will probably become clear as I tell you more about it. The one thing about this series is I reread this first book in 2020. I don't know if I got this idea for this video all the way back in 2020 or what, but I reread this book, hated the reread so much that I got rid of the copy of the book that I had purchased specifically to reread it. And then when I went back to this video idea and tried rereading this again, I thought that I would just be able to reread and like kind of refresh my memory on what happened in this first book. No, I forgot everything that happened in this book. I put the entire plot line that happens in this first book, put it in a box, locked it up, and threw it in the ocean because I could not tell you what happened in this book, even though I'd reread it the most recently out of all of the books in this video, which I find insane. But let's go ahead and get into the story, shall we? So Glass Houses follows Claire. She is a 16-year-old, once again, and she is going to school in a out-of-state college for mathematics or something like that. I don't really remember, because she's super smart. And when the book starts, she is violently thrown down some stairs by college-aged women for being super smart. Yes, a teenager, a minor, is going to school out of state, away from her parents, and she's being violently brutalized as a form of hazing. Like, I know that I'm the big age of 28, and when I was the 15, 16 age range, I probably thought that going out of state to college without my parents was probably just a fucking normal idea. But now I'm like, you let the minor run around on a college campus? No. And that's just a regular college campus. This college campus is riddled with vampires. Because yes, the town of Morganville has a ruling class of vampires. The girls that threw Claire down the stairs their families have a deal with other vampires on like this ruling class to protect them from being A, thrown out of school for hazing, and B, eaten by the vampires. Because the way this works is this college campus works as a feeding ground. The kids that don't have deals with the vampire class are picked off as food supply. What? Now you're probably wondering, how does an entire town like just ignore the vampires feeding on the local population? Because, if I saw on a college brochure that in this particular town, the level of vampire deaths is like much higher than the rest of the country, that would probably not be on my first schools to go to, right? At some point you find out that there's like some sort of spell in the town where if you leave the town, you forget all about the vampires. But it's, it's not even really well explained. It's just, there's just vampires just everywhere. You just run with it. We don't remember if we leave. So go fuck yourself if you've got questions, But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to our resident jailbait, Claire. Because just like a lot of these early 2000s books, the concept of like older dudes hitting on minors, they're super cool with it. Basically what I'm saying is there's an age gap romance incoming. So Claire is trying to escape being murdered by bullies. So she sees an ad for a room in a house that's for rent, and she goes off campus to find out if she can get this room. And she winds up looking at a basically mansion of a house and is trying to decide if she should really not just pack up and go home, Which to me seems like the normal response to being thrown down some stairs, but do you, I guess. So outside this McMansion of a house, she runs into this 18-year-old goth chick named Eve, who happens to be one of the roommates in the house looking for another roommate. Eve basically explains to Claire that it's dangerous for her to go back to the campus because she doesn't have a deal with a vampire and, death and hazing and all that. Claire doesn't believe her, which, if I was a super genius and some random goth chick told me the town I had moved away from my parents to go to school at had an infestation of vampires, I might be a little bit skeptical as well, considering the fact at this point she hasn't seen any of these vampires. But considering the fact that she is kind of in some mortal danger, she's like, well, I might as well just take the room anyway. I don't want to go back and get my ass beat, especially because of this one chick, Monica, who was basically running the whole gang. And then we find out that Monica is the ex of one of the guys that lives in the house. Everybody meets Shane. And the reason why baby Maddie thought everyone with the name Shane was very, very hot. Considering the love interest that we have in this video to talk about, Shane happens to be kind of a Joe average kid. I think he's like maybe 18 or 19. He's not actually that much older than Claire, but oh my God, he makes a bunch of jailbait jokes. Like, he makes it very aware that he's being weird about her age range. He also doesn't seem to have much personality other than playing video games and making chili. He doesn't have a job. And he makes a lot of gay jokes. He's just really low on the actual interesting scale, which, considering the fact that the other guy that lives in the house is far more interesting, I'm very surprised that we even went with him as the main love interest. And I'll get to the other guy here in a second. Still prefacing the fact that he makes a lot of uncomfortable, insinuations about Claire, and she's very sheltered and very naive. And it just kind of goes with the same track record that every one of these girls kind of has the same, except for maybe Skylar, has the same naivety about whatever, you understand. They've never been with anybody. So most of the time, a lot of these older characters are kind of oh, we shouldn't because you're so sheltered. And they're like, I don't want to be sheltered though. It's just, bleh, I don't get it. But But speaking of romantic relationships, let's talk about the ship in this book that deserved its own sail. You know what I'm saying? And that's Eve and Michael, the owner of the glass house. Now, Michael isn't around during the day, but he's also young. He's probably like maybe 20. They also have beer in the house all the time, but I don't know who's buying it for them because none of them are 21. And they also aren't friends with anyone in the town. Like, they're kind of outsiders. They don't have deals with anyone else, like vampire-wise. But they don't, I don't know who's buying them beer, basically. That's my, I'm like, you're all underage. Just, weird 2000s things. Like, you just don't really know where the beer's coming from, but someone's buying them beer. To speed things along, Michael is apparently half of a ghost. He was attacked by a vampire, and the vampire tried to turn him into a vampire, but didn't succeed. And now Michael is basically non-corporeal during the day, like he's ghosty, you can't see him. But then at night, he's like a dude. He's just a regular dude. He basically turns back into a regular human, which I'm gonna say is kind of the best part of the whole book. Michael is like super strong too. Like, that whole element of the story is fascinating. I really like the idea of the glass house has become kind of tied to his spirit. So the house itself is very much protected on its own thing because of whatever the fuck happened to Michael. So Eve, the goth chick from earlier, and Michael have this like mutual pining for each other, but neither one of them will just like come out and say it. Loved it. Which I do find interesting because Eve and Shane have been living with Michael for months at this point, but neither one of them know about this whole ghost situation. They just assume he's just not around during the day. But Claire is in the house for like 2 seconds and she straight up sees Michael turn into this ghost thing. Like, he's there, all of a sudden he just drops and then disappears. Like, how is it that like these guys are your best friends, but they don't know that you happen to be a ghost during the day? Like, it just doesn't make sense. The rest of the book is kind of about like trying to figure out how to protect Claire from the vampires, and also Shane's past relationship with Monica, this like crazy bitch who wants to kill Claire for some reason, because once again, there is this predominant characterization that everyone hates the main character, specifically one very pretty girl. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. All honesty, the vampires aren't really that scary, mostly because considering who she is as a character, I was kind of rooting for someone to gank Claire by the end of the book. Literally the stupidest, most aggravating character for someone who's supposed to be very smart. Her whining and attitude problems about not being able to go to school when she's in mortal danger just truly drove me nuts. One of Monica's like minions pours acid on this teenager during a science class, and before Claire passes out from pain, she apologizes for making a mess. Like, what were we going through in the early 2000s that this was appropriate? Like, what? Like, if your academic achievements right now are more important than your bodily health, your physical health, your mental health, you should stop everything and maybe reassess your priorities. This also applies to your job. Like, if someone poured acid on you right now, if you were at your job and someone did that to you, and your first thought is to apologize for making a mess, it might be time to take a break. You might need to just think about things for a little bit. You know what I'm saying? Now, I don't really have much more on the plot line about that one because the rest of the first installment in that series is really boring. The reveals weren't very interesting. But once again, I do remember the series getting wild as shit. So let me know if you want more videos in this series. All right, let's talk about Vampire Academy. I reread the entirety of the Vampire Academy series really early on when I started my channel, and I did not enjoy them. I really enjoyed the live shows that I did with Carolyn. I loved talking about them. They were a fun time to kind of go back to, but nostalgia didn't win out in this bitch. I did not like having to reread this series as an adult and then realizing that a lot of the bad tropes in this series became really entrenched into who I was as a teenager. And I had to unlearn a lot of the shit that was in this book series. But I will say I find it fascinating that this series, out of all of these series, has not one but two different adaptations at this point, which I'll be talking about in this little segment because I just think it's relevant. And it's my video, so we're gonna do that. The movie, I will say, is kind of an atrocious adaptation. The main character, Rose, is done dirty in the movie. And the world building in this series is the most political out of all of the books I'm gonna be talking about, and it's probably the most complex. There's a ruling class of vampires called Moroi. They're pureblood. They can be born, I think. And then there's half Moroi, half human people called Dampers, which are basically stronger humans, and they can they protect the Moroi. And then there's Strigoi, which are undead vampires, and they become like that either by drinking a Moroi, drinking a human to death, or biting and exchanging blood with a Damper or a Moroi or a human. It's not really necessary for you to understand the entire details of the political strife, but I just find it interesting that this series specifically happens to be the most politically complex, but the first book is really, really boring when it comes to kind of telling you what's going on in the world, mostly because it's very focused on the romance. So as I was saying, the movie doesn't really do a great job of explaining the world, doing the characters right, or really anything. I don't particularly like who they casted. The main girl, loved her. She's fantastic. Don't remember her name. Thought she did great. She's not Rose Hathaway though. Rose Hathaway is probably one of my all-time favorite main characters in pretty much any book series, still to this day. In the book series, she's not white, which I do find to be probably the only representation that isn't pseudo yucky. Like with Zoe, she's supposed to be potentially 1/4 Native American, maybe. But with Rose, she actually does have this strange kind of relationship with race. Her father, who she does not know, who's supposedly Moroi, is Middle Eastern, supposedly, but really the only thing that Rose has to deal with race is the fact that her body type is more exotic than the other people that she's around. And considering the fact that the school, Vampire Academy, is actually located in Montana, that kind of makes sense. And now, if you will allow me a tangent, the Rose that they have in the show, which I had zero interest in and until I watched Full of Lit's video reacting to it, and now I'm kind of low-key obsessed with the main characters, other than the fact that the Rose that they casted has like a British accent. I think she's British. I'm not quite sure. And I know that this is a little bit weird, but I never imagined Rose to have a European accent. And it was always kind of funnier when she said comrade as an American to Dimitri. I'm getting ahead of myself. That is my only nitpick from what I can tell of the show. Let me go ahead and talk about the plot, since I haven't talked about the plot at all. Rose is a Damper. She is the best friend with Lisa, who is a princess to one of these royal families in this world. At the start of the book, they have been on the run from literally the whole vampire community for 2 years. And bear in mind, they're both teenagers. So teenagers in the early 2000s were extremely resourceful compared to, I think, pretty much any teenager that's ever existed, ever. That's probably not true, but I just find it fascinating. So at the start of the book, they're on the run, and then Dmitry Belikov, ladies and gentlemen, shows up and captures them and takes them back to the Vampire Academy. Don't remember what the academy's name is. I don't remember if it has a name. It's just called Vampire Academy at this point. But let's talk about Dmitry Belikov. I gotta say that this book and Dmitry from Anastasia gave me a very wrong impression about men named Dmitry. I will just say that right now. Gotta be my favorite genre of white boy. Okay, so I want you to picture this person if you haven't read this series. Dmitry is mid-20s. He is a guardian Damper man, and he's got like massive muscles. He wears a leather duster coat and he likes reading Western novels. The characterization is just funny to me now. Like, looking back on this, I was obsessed with this man as a teenager. But if I saw this man now as a person who is now older than his character is in the book, I would laugh in his face. Whereas the guy in the show, Okay, I understand it. So our two runaway heroines are back at the Vampire Academy. They just go back to classes just like normal, even though they've been gone for 2 years. And things just kind of start rolling. Rose is kind of known to be a little bit of a hotshot. She's got this reputation of being a little flirtatious, even though she's never done anything. That would be too scandalous. But as we kind of go along, we find out that there's something special about Lisa. Now, in this world, the vampires have the ability to like master elemental powers, which is also similar to House of Night, which I didn't really get into. But Lisa's never materialized any of these powers. But she does have this weird bond thing with Rose. So at times, Rose can like snap into Lisa's head and see things through her eyes, which I found a very interesting narrative choice because instead of always being trapped in Rose's head, we have this world building magic system thing that basically connects Rose with Lisa's POV. So we can have a break from Rose for a little bit, which love Rose to death. She can be a little exhausting. Now, it is a bit spoilery about what Rose's power or what Lisa's power is. So if you don't want to know what happens in this first book series, even though I've spoiled the rest of the books, maybe skip this for now. But Lisa's power is spirit. She has basically this like really, really rare power where she can raise things from the dead and heal and all of that. And the reason why Rose has this ability to see through Lisa's eyes is because Rose was dead and Lisa basically healed her, and now they have this shadow kiss bond situation, and it really helps narrative wise as well as keeping Lisa alive because the girl gets captured like every fucking book from what I remember. Haven't reread the whole series, but I do know that it does come in handy a lot. But let's go ahead and focus on the romance because that's really what this main book is about. Now, Dimitri is this like big hotshot guardian, and for Rose to stay in school, she basically has to train with him. And she thinks this guy is just hot shit. Like, she thinks he's very, very attractive. And he basically tells her, this is never happening. Now, I did mention that there's a lot of age gap romances in the 2000s basically history. And I know that, 7 years, which is the difference between Dimitri and Rose, isn't like, the 125 between Edward and Bella or whatever. But I do find it interesting that like there is a lot that this book series does to like combat this age gap being a problem. And I know for a fact that like, when you're an adult and the age gap is 7 years, it's different. But when it's a teenager and you're a student, that's a little bit of a problem. But I've really kind of come to terms with the fact that in my teenage years, it was really wildly accepted to have teenage student relationships. Like there was Ezra and Arya from Pretty Little Liars, Dmitry Belikov, and fucking Rose. Like this was everywhere in the like 2010s and 2000s, like very strange to me. The way that this book gets around the fact that the main love interest is like, you are too young for me and also you're my student, we should not do this, is magically roofying them. So to kind of explain that, there's this point where Lisa's been kidnapped and someone spells a piece of jewelry that Rose is wearing and she irresistibly feels like she needs to go find Dimitri, and then they see each other and they start tearing each other's clothes off. Yep. Which is just, they don't end up doing anything in this installment, and I know for a fact that things get wild as the books go on, and I remember being extremely uncomfortable with the way things do progress. But I can definitively say that rereading the first book, the plotline was really slow and boring, and I can only assume that rereading them would be just as painful as rereading this one was. But who knows? I would hazard a guess that it'll be a fascinating ride so far. And I can handily say that for all of the world building in these book series, this one has the most interesting political scale. And if you've watched the show, please let me know if you like it. I don't want to pay for Peacock, but I am very interested to see if that show has any merit, considering the fact that I'm pretty sure it's from the creator of The Vampire Diaries. And that could be interesting, if you know what I'm saying. talk about the book that I've been wanting to talk about this entire time, because this is the only one that I thoroughly enjoyed. I got a little crazy-eyed there, sorry about that. This completely contradicts my earlier review for this book that I posted on December 2nd, 2012, where I one-starred this book. Now, please bear in mind, a decade ago, Maddie was not the same person that you see here today. She was in her ultimate not like other girls era. This is around the time I was bashing Twilight really hard. In general, I kind of hated everything girly or just women in general. Like it was a bad time. Big pick-me-bitch energy from 2012 era is what I'm saying. But what is Vampire Kisses? This is the one that, it came out the earliest. It came out before Twilight, and it has like a strong vibe of early 2000s. It's got this very jovial tone. It kind of feels almost middle grade-esque. And it follows this character named Raven, who's a 16-year-old growing up in Dolesville, which I don't necessarily know if the town's name is actually Dolesville or if our main character Raven is just calling it that, because it's got this very campy, jocular tone where you kind of have to take everything with a grain of salt, because Raven is not a reliable narrator, if you would kind of understand. The one thing I can say about Vampire Kisses is that it just gives me the sense that it kind of came out before Harry Potter and Twilight like revolutionized kidlit, because in the first 30 pages, Raven tells the audience that she was conceived on her hippie parents' waterbed. This is also the slimmest of the books, and it really just gets going very quickly. So Raven's whole thing is that she is goth and basically like a mini Wednesday Addams. And additionally, above all else, she wants to be a vampire. It is her life goal. Everyone around her kind of treats her like this kid with this hyperfixation on vampires. She just really likes vampires and dressing in black. She's just a little bit weird. We can just deal with that. I do remember even when I was young finding this character extremely grating. But she's supposed to be like that, and now I kind of find that really fun to read about. She's incredibly unapologetic about who she is. She loves vampires. Go fuck yourself if you don't like vampires. Like, she just is really cool. If I met Raven right now, like a 16-year-old who just really likes vampires, I would find her really intimidating, I think. But also, like, you're cool. Do whatever you like, you know? Not just, well, don't move to a different school with a bunch of vampires in it. That's my line, apparently. So for the first half of this relatively short book, as I was saying, you get to know Raven and her town. She has a best friend that she would protect with her life, and she also has this extremely antagonistic relationship with this boy, Trevor, from her school, who's a bit of a bully. And the one thing I can say about this book is that even though this kid is just a punk-ass bitch and he's mean to her, and it's clearly because he has a crush on her, the book does something that the other books in this video did not do. And it basically took the character that is this character, this bully, this mean boy, and made him the villain of this book. And I found that to be fascinating. Because if you've been on my channel long enough, you know that I have a lot of frustration with specifically romances where the main love interest is mean to the main character for no fucking reason. And it's mostly because boys will be boys, they're mean to the girl they like. Whereas in this book, that trope is completely deconstructed. Like, Raven is fully aware that this boy likes her, and she don't give no shits. At a party that Raven goes to with her best friend, this boy makes a move on Raven, and she's like, fuck it, might as well. So they start making out. She leads him into the woods. He strips naked, and he's like, let's do the do, monster girl. And she's like, okay. She steals his clothes, leaves his ass in the woods, butt-ass naked, and dips. That, ladies and gentlebeans, is queen shit. And bear in mind, this is all written in the style of like what today's middle grade is. It's pure camp, to be honest. Now, in this town, there's this creepy mansion that's been like abandoned for years, and the kids have always been like, oh, you won't go break in there, you know, kid stuff. So when the town gets wind of the fact that the mansion has a family moving into it, you can imagine the flutter this causes, especially considering that the family that moves into the mansion seems a little bit vampire-y. So of course the resident bully is like, I'm gonna go fuck with the McMansion and the vampires. And Raven's like, you're not gonna do that. And bear in mind, her Halloween costume is a normie tennis outfit. On Halloween, this bully kid is running up on the house and trying to break in, and Raven is having none of it. So she clocks him with her dad's tennis racket, which I absolutely loved. And that becomes the kind of the premise of the book, of her affording to pay for her dad to get a new tennis racket. It's a tangent I don't really care about, so we're moving on. And as she's running away from the McMansion on the Halloween night, she turns around and sees him, the one and only Alexander Sterling. He's tall, he's broody, he's got long dark hair, and he's totally a vampire. But he's not. Or is he? Which is pretty much the rest of the premise of the book. I don't want to spoil this one for you guys because I find that the interactions that Raven and Alexander have to be very, very cute. And I just really liked the fact that most of this book isn't about like cringy romance between people who aren't of the same age range. Even though I cannot quite recall if there's an age gap there with Alexander, but I just find it to be absolutely the sweetest book, and I'm very glad I reread it, and I would really like to read on. But if you guys are interested in another video, please let me know, because oh dear God, this is going to be a lot of work, so you will have to be patient, because it took me a good 3 months to read all these books, and it's been a long time coming. And as you can probably tell, my favorite out of all of the books was Vampire Kisses. I found this to be a fantastically enjoyable little story. Don't go into it thinking it's going to be steamy or adult at all. It's not. It's a very much a YA 2000s cutesy little like vampire book, and I had a blast reading it. It was adorable. I highly recommend it. The other ones in this series, Blue Bloods, I would recommend. Pretty much nothing else. If you like Vampire Academy, that one's good too. But I can definitively say I don't know what was going on in the 2000s, because all of these came out within like just the same time frame. And as someone who is aware of how long it takes to write a book, I don't honestly think Twilight could have spawned all of these. I just think publishers were like, if you have a vampire book, we'll publish it right now. And that's why maybe a lot of these became very, very popular. And I know that their series just get more insane from there. But if you guys like this video, go ahead and leave me a vampire emoji down below, or a skull emoji if you don't have a vampire one. I'm gonna go now, guys. Like, subscribe, all the good stuff. Bye!